Today I'm talking to Mark Stockhowe. Mark is a fractional executive with 25 years of experience in Fortune 50 companies and a further 15 years helping early stage companies get going. Mark, I see your tagline is making ideas real. What do you mean by that?
Well, thanks, Matthew, and good to talk to you here this morning. Making ideas real really takes the process of going from what I describe as the inspiration through full implementation. What are the steps along the way that are going to give you the best chance of seeing that idea realized? And it's a process that I've put together that I do tailor. It's not a one size fits all process, but to the individual company, to the individual circumstance.
And so, can you give some examples of the type of things that you help companies with?
Sure. The most common thing I think people think of, especially, is implementing a new product or service, right? We're going to roll something new out. And that's what comes to mind for most folks. And it's a fair one. It's what people think of most commonly. At the same time, there are a lot of internal initiatives that are important to a company that also are about making an idea real. And I've got a different approach, similar but different approach that we use in doing that as well.
And so, what are some common pitfalls that companies fall into when they're trying to make an idea happen, when they're trying to get out that new product?
Yeah, great question. There's a lot of them, as you might expect, but the ones you run into most frequently in the what I call the ideation phase, um, a lot of times people come up with an idea and they grab the first idea and they run with it. They don't really take a time to vet it out, to compare it to other ideas they might have, other priorities in the company. And so that's one of them, is just jumping to a conclusion that said, this is what we want to do. And interestingly enough, I've seen that happen in large companies that have, in theory, a very formal process for vetting out and managing a portfolio of ideas. I also see it a lot in early stage companies where someone has an idea, let's go run with it. And in both cases, you need to have a little bit more discipline and thought about what you're going to work on. No organization, regardless of size, has an unlimited budget of time and resources to implement every idea that comes along. So you've got to take a hard look at what's going to give us the most bang for the buck and most likelihood of success as well.
So,
That
what
would
do
be one. So go ahead.
right.
I was going to say that would be in the ideation phase. Likewise, with preparation, one of the common pitfalls I see is a lack of change management. Change management to me is primarily, how do you get your employees, your stakeholders, all the people that are impacted by the change, how do you engage them in making this change? And again, a new product launch is going to be different than rolling out a new sales system internally. But nonetheless, you need to make sure that everyone is on board from the top to the bottom of the organization. Otherwise, you end up with, I was in an organization once where there was some things being rolled out from on high, and they were rolling out with some frequency. And one of my peers said, "Don't worry, this too shall pass." Now, given that attitude, what do you think kind of the focus and the commitment to making that change work was? Not very high.
Yeah, pretty low, I would
So,
guess.
yeah. And then lastly, with implementation, a common thing there is, hey, let's say a new product. We've launched it. Hey, we've succeeded. Let's work on. Very few things get rolled out that don't have hiccups along the way. Things don't go exactly as expected. You need to monitor that rollout, that launch, and say, what do we need to adjust? What didn't we get quite right? How is the market not addressing, or our employees not reacting the way we thought to what we just rolled out? Those would be the three I think most often are pitfalls, if you will, of making ideas real.
And so, do the challenges that companies have tend to vary from a very small company to a very large company?
Yes and no. I will say that large companies, because they're just the complexity of the organization and the number of people to engage, yeah, it needs to be more complex. A small company, it's not appropriate to take that same level of complexity and expect that to be launched a product launch with a company of 50 people. It's not practical. It's not going to work. It's not affordable. So that's probably the biggest difference between them, is just having to scale that making ideas real to that particular situation and to that particular company.
Do you see different levels of engagement in small versus large companies?
It depends. There's a good consulting answer for you. It truly does depend by organizations. If you get to an organization where people are truly engaged in the company, they're on board with the vision and the mission of where the company's going, you see people get engaged much more often. But in any organization, the big change and the challenge is when employees, when stakeholders don't see what's in it for them, and they see more of a danger or a risk as opposed to an opportunity.
So a lot of this seems to be coming down to the mistakes that leadership makes. Can you kind of talk through how a leader should introduce a new change to an organization and go about executing on that change?
Sure. Well, then we're talking about now that preparation phase, that middle one, which is critical, and that's where you get into change management. The big thing for leadership to understand is any change, given this nature of human beings, there's always going to be what's this going to happen? What's this going to impact? What's the impact of this going to be on me as an individual? And the sadness part of human beings is we tend to look at the negative before the positive. So I do see folks I had a VP one time tell me, Mark, you don't need to worry about that. My team will do what I tell them to. That was fairly early on in this process with me. And guess what? Not all his team members were on board the way it. Now, they all gave him lip service. They all said, yeah, we're right behind you. And the reality is they did the minimum, just like my other colleague. This too shall pass. It's not their priority. You need to get them engaged and understand why this is important to the mission and the outcome of the organization as everything else they're working on. They need to buy in as much as you did.
So you talked about the challenge where the team doesn't feel like this new initiative is their priority. How does a leader go about aligning the priorities of a team?
Realistically, it comes down to communication. You're really talking about the interests. You're talking about having their interests aligned with the interests of the organization. And a lot of that comes down to understanding. So it's not just do this, right? 9 times out, only in case of emergency should you as a leader say, do this because I said so. You want your team to be on board because they believe it. And so if I'm the leader of an organization, let's say I've got 3 levels in the organization, I need to sit down one-on-one with each of my folks. I need to have a conversation about why this is important, understand what their concerns are, come to an agreement on how we'll address those concerns. And then likewise, at each level below them, you need to have the same conversation, and you need to follow up with them. What did you hear from your folks? So it's inspect what you expect, right? That's an old saying, but it's very, very clear when you're that you need to do that when you're trying to implement change in an organization, trying to make an idea real. You can have 8 out of 10 people on board with a new change initiative. If 2 of them or even 1 of them are the wrong ones, if they're not on board, it can fail. They'll torpedo it because they didn't buy in and it's not aligned with their priorities and their self-interest.
Are you a big fan of using a KPI or an OKR process to really align priorities across an organization?
Yes, whatever the thing is, whatever the method that your organization uses, it's important to have a way to measure and align those measurements across the organization. I see a lot of times folks might give an example here. When you're trying to roll out a new idea, something new to implement within the organization, if it affects sales, people might say, oh, we'll just talk to the sales organization. There's a lot of other parts of the organization that maybe and probably are impacted by that. Might be sales support, might be order processing. Multiple parts of the organization are impacted. And again, if they're not supportive, if they're not aligned, you're likely not, at the very least, not going to get the results you're looking for, and it may actually completely fail. having those kind of KPIs, those measurements in place, help align people so that, yes, I know this is over here, but this is how it affects me and what I'm doing as well.
So you get to see how a lot of companies perform. The companies using an operating system like an EOS or OKRs, do they tend to perform better, or is it just a different way of doing it?
That's a great question. My experience is, number one, there's a lot of people that say they use an operating system and use those metrics,
Sure.
and they don't really. In fact, number of conversations I've had is, well, we're doing this, but not really, right? And when I get down to it, they've dressed up their meetings with some nice terms. We have, and we have level 10 meetings, and we have rocks, whatever the case may be. But when it comes down to it, they're not really operating that way. And part of it sometimes is, I have found, and this is at the very highest level of a small business, where the executive leadership team isn't even on board with following on what that process is and how they've agreed to operate. It's again human nature, and it's one thing as a leader that's very important to do in terms of making sure you're going to make that idea real. Is everyone aligned? Is everyone committed to making it real?
Yeah, that's interesting to hear. I have to say that most of the conversations I've had around operating systems have gone that way, where people have said, "Well, we're using this, but not really." So
Yeah.
I'm
Or
not surprised to hear you say that.
my favorite one is we have a modified version of X, and there's nothing wrong with that. But when you get down to it, it's a watered down version of X.
Yeah, a recipe is good, and the recipe can be different. But if you want the same type of cookies every time, you got to use a recipe.
Yeah, exactly. Consistency, and then once again, follow through and commitment to making it work. I mean, any operating system comes down to prioritization and communication between players,
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
That's what it's there to do. And if people are not communicating, it doesn't matter.
So, Mark, as you work with a lot of different organizations making change real, is there one particular kind of change that you see tends to catch organizations again and again? What type of change is most difficult for organizations?
I'm going to cheat on this response that I'm going to give you two different ones and broad categories, but let me give you the specifics of each. The
Sounds good.
first one is some sort of new product or service introduction. I see too many companies take it too casually. They'll do what historically was called a soft launch or a rolling launch. Well, we'll just do a little bit at a time. And the problem is there's no commitment to that. There's no acknowledgement of that in the marketplace. People that what is this new thing here? There hasn't been any real communication for it, an announcement. So you're catching people unawares, and that can fail for multiple reasons. So if you've got something important, it's significant, make sure the world, or the part of the world that matters for your company, knows about it. It's very important. So that's what product launch and the soft launch is the problem there. On an internal launch, the thing I see mostly is, I already mentioned it, but is the fact that people will do what I tell them to, right? From a leader, just everybody will automatically line up. And there's an intention to do that, but the reality is we all either don't understand because it hasn't really been explained to us, or we misunderstand because we think, oh, this is going to be bad for me. I don't think I'm going to get in behind this. That tends to happen the larger the organization gets, but it can happen in small organizations too. And that all comes down to trust and communication.
Yeah, yeah, trust and communication. I hear that. So, Mark, a company's engaged you to help make a change real. How do you engage? Do you work with leadership? Do you work with the executive team? Do you work across the whole company? What's the best, most effective way to really help an organization from your, engagement model?
Yeah, it depends, like many things, on what the change is and what the size of the organization is. For a very small organization, it may take the form of executive coaching or laying out the process and just touching base with them. How are we doing on this, and so on? How's the communication going? As organizations get more complex and the initiative becomes more critical to the organization, you might go to an actual consulting engagement, and that can run a gamut of different pieces. I could be working with the entire team. I could be working only with the executive team. Once again, it depends on the situation. And then the third and more special case is with an organization, especially an early stage organization that is trying to grow quickly. I can and will take on a role as a fractional executive, coming in, taking a seat at the table on the management team, maybe not full-time, most likely part-time, but taking over an executive role on their team and driving that day to day as part of the team, with taking on the same metrics for success and so forth that the rest of the team has. That's clearly the most intense way, and it would typically be reserved for the most critical needs.
So, Mark, you help companies make ideas real, but I'm guessing they don't pull you in because they've just decided to make an idea real. They pull you in because they've tried to make an idea real in the past, or they're trying to make one real right now and it's not going well. Can you talk a little bit about when you typically get pulled in and what kind of engagement it is?
So Matthew, the two places I'm engaged with most frequently are ideation and preparation phase. Not as much in implementation. It's typically too late by then. In ideation, the case is typically, we're having a hard time agreeing on what ideas we're going to work on, or have we baked out ideas enough to actually launch them? How are we prioritizing ideas, or how are we misprioritizing ideas? A favorite example I have here, and I've seen this happen in small organizations up to Fortune 50 organizations. They may have a process for intake of ideas, assessing ideas, and prioritizing them. And then there is some sort of executive override that is used 9 times out of 10, right?
Yeah.
We went through and did all the work, and now we're going to go ahead. Well, I just know this is the right thing to do. I'm all for intuition and the fact that an executive was brought in to bring that experience that they have to the table. However, just to disregard whatever's there in anything other than an emergency is probably not a good way to run your organization. And it's certainly not a good way to keep your people engaged and believing in the process. So that's probably the big thing I've seen in ideation, is the putting the thumb on the scale, is the way I like to talk about it, when it comes to prioritizing and selecting which approach to take and which ideas to pursue.
Yeah, I've seen that so many times myself. The leader lacks humility. They're the smartest person in the room and they know what the company needs to do. And everybody else be damned, and everybody else learns that their opinion doesn't matter. And they're just there to play a role.
Yes, absolutely. And the sad thing about those situations is not only does the initiative likely to fail, but morale is impacted. So it's going to permeate throughout the organization well past this initial initiative. I've seen that in a small organization, it just, people look to the CEO, the owner, whatever. Oh, John, you think we should do that? Fine. It's not as visible. Where it kills things is in the medium and large company, where they put together this formal process and people fill out these spreadsheets and do all this work. And then you say, well, how did this get approved? Oh, that was executive discretion, or that was the override button, or whatever. And it's like, then why did we have the rest? And again, there's a time and a place. If you're familiar with system 1 versus system 2 thinking, system 1 is knee jerk. The building's on fire. We need to get out of the building, right?
Mm-hmm.
System 2 is, we need to give this some reasoned discussion about what are we going to do? How are we trying to do things? And to just have somebody say, damn the torpedoes, we're going to go, full speed ahead on this, regardless of what the numbers to say. I won't say that's never the right thing to do, but I see that happen way too much. Anyway, that's a
Yeah.
sidebar.
Some other problem I also see is where a company can't choose between it. They've got 3 great ideas, and you know what? They're all great ideas, and they could be successful at any one of them, but they choose to be successful at all 3 of them, and they fail at all 3 of them, and they lack the discipline to make a choice and stick to that choice and really put their heads down.
Very true.